Today I will be talking about the definition of addiction, how drugs disrupt the brain, structures and functions of the limbic system, structures and functions of the reward system, specific drugs and the area of the brain they influence, and lastly, neurotransmitters, what region of the brain they influence and what drugs affect them. Addiction is defined as a chronic, relapsing brain disease that is characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use, despite harmful consequences. It is considered a brain disease because drugs change the brain. They change the structure and how it works. Brain changes can be long-lasting and can lead to harmful behaviors seen in people who abuse drugs. Brain imaging studies of people with addiction show physical changes in areas of the brain that are critical to judgment, decision-making, learning and memory, and behavior control. Here we have a scan of two brains, a healthy brain and a diseased brain of a cocaine abuser. The healthy brain on the left has a prefrontal cortex that is highlighted in yellow, showing a lot of activity. The same prefrontal cortex in the cocaine abuser is very dim, showing very little activity. Drugs are chemicals that affect the brain by tapping into its communication system and interfering with the way neurons normally send, receive, and process information. Some drugs, such as marijuana and heroin, actually mimic the structure of natural neurotransmitters. Other drugs, such as amphetamines or cocaine, can cause neurons to release abnormally large amounts of natural neurotransmitters, or they can prevent the normal recycling of these brain chemicals. We'll talk about the limbic system. It's in the center of the brain. It's activated by healthy, life-sustaining activities such as eating and socializing, but it is also activated by drug abuse. The limbic system controls and regulates our ability to feel pleasure. Feeling pleasure motivates us to repeat behaviors that are critical to our existence. However, overstimulating the system with drugs produces euphoric effects, which strongly reinforce the behavior of drug use, teaching the user to repeat it. The limbic system is responsible for perception of other emotions, which explains the mood-altering properties of many drugs like LSD, PCP, and mushrooms. The hippocampus is in the lower portion of the limbic system. It is important in forming new memories and connecting emotions and senses, such as smell and sound, to memories. Damage to the hippocampus in humans can cause amnesia. People with damage to the hippocampus are forced to live in the present and are identified with short-term memory problems. The thalamus, which is a large organ located in the center of the limbic system, is involved in sensory perception and regulation of motor functions. It receives auditory, somatosensory, and visual sensory signals, relays sensory signals to the cerebral cortex, and controls sleep and awake cycles. Damaging the thalamus can cause distortion of sensory perception, visual field dysfunction, and/or auditory perception. It will also cause sleep pattern disturbances. The hypothalamus is located on the frontal aspect of the limbic system. It is involved in behavioral, autonomic, and endocrine processes. It is closely associated with the pituitary gland, which regulates body temperature, thirst, hunger, sleep, circadian rhythm, moods, and sex drive. Damaging the hypothalamus can cause body temperature dysregulation, extreme weight loss or extreme weight gain, impotence, and changes in menstrual cycle. The amygdala, which is located in the lower aspect of the limbic system, is involved in signaling the cortex of motivationally significant stimuli, such as those related to reward and fear, in addition to social functionings such as mating. The amygdala is the primary center for the fight or flight responses associated with the sympathetic nervous system. It acts much like a smoke detector would in a house. It's always on, looking and sensing for danger. Damaging the amygdala can cause placid calmness in humans, characterized as a flatness of affect, problems with fear processing associated with anxiety disorders such as PTSD. We will now cover the reward system. The primary neurotransmitter associated with the reward system is dopamine. Dopamine causes an individual to be motivated to start something and keeps the individual focused on the task once it has begun. Dopamine's role in motivation is twofold, one of rewarding for beneficial behavior or desired behavior, and one of behavioral activation. There are three parts to the reward system. We'll start with the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. When a drug activates the VTA neurons, these neurons release dopamine into the nucleus accumbens, and the person feels pleasure. The nucleus accumbens is a collection of neurons within the forebrain. It is thought to play an important role in reward, laughter, pleasure, addiction, and fear. It is the area of the brain that drives people to action. The frontal and prefrontal cortex are located on the anterior frontal portion of the brain. The five major areas of the prefrontal cortex that may become severely damaged by drug and alcohol abuse/addiction are behavior, controlling one's actions, having the ability to think or feel a certain way and acting with appropriate behavior, development of an individual or social conscience, i.e. self-aware or insight, knowing when something is not right and acting accordingly, decision-making, thinking before you act, gathering of information before acting, the skill of making an informed decision, impulse control, thinking things through instead of immediately acting on a feeling or thought, and lastly, focus, being able to stay with a project or task, the ability to get the job done, are all issues associated with the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine transmission originates in the VTA. Dopamine is transferred from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens, and then transferred from the nucleus accumbens to the frontal cortex. Switching gears, we will now talk about alcohol, nicotine, opiates such as heroin, stimulants such as cocaine and amphetamines, and their effects. Alcohol primarily affects three areas of the brain: the cerebral cortex, with problem solving and decision making, the hippocampus, which is important for memory and learning, and the cerebellum, which is important for movement and coordination. It has long been observed that alcoholics have memory problems. This may be due to the negative impact alcohol has on the hippocampus, the center of new memory formation. Alcohol binds to and modulates the activity of various specific receptors of the neurotransmitter systems that are located within the brain reward pathway. Alcohol is similar to other abused substances in that it increases the nucleus accumbens dopamine release. Nicotine exerts its effect in the brain by acting on a specific type of receptor for the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, known as the nicotinic receptor. Some nicotinic receptors are located in the cell bodies of dopamine neurons within the VTA, and activation of these receptors increases the activity of these dopamine neurons, leading to an increase in dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens, which is thought to mediate reward. Opiates such as heroin and morphine enhance the nucleus accumbens dopamine release by increasing the activity of VTA dopamine neurons. Opiates also have dopamine-independent effects within the nucleus accumbens, which play an important role in opiate reward. Stimulant drugs such as cocaine and amphetamines are substances that typically cause heightened feelings of well-being and euphoria and an increased state of arousal. Amphetamines and cocaine inhibit dopamine reuptake into the nerve terminals via the dopamine transporter. So not only do these substances increase dopamine production, they inhibit its breakdown. We'll now talk about neurotransmitters and receptors. The neurotransmitters are the brain's chemical messengers, whereas the receptors are the brain's chemical receivers. The neurotransmitter and its receptor operate like a lock and key. Each receptor will forward the appropriate message only after interacting with the right kind of neurotransmitter. Next, I will discuss specific neurotransmitters, where they are distributed in the central nervous system, what functions are affected by them, and what drugs affect that particular neurotransmitter. Acetylcholine is distributed in the hippocampus, cerebral cortex, thalamus, basal ganglia, and cerebellum. Acetylcholine affects memory, arousal, attention, and mood. And nicotine affects acetylcholine. Dopamine is found in the midbrain, the VTA, the cerebral cortex, and hypothalamus. It affects pleasure and reward, motivation, attention, and memory. Drugs that affect dopamine are cocaine, methamphetamine, and amphetamines. Next we have endogenous cannabinoids. They are found in the cerebral cortex, hippocampus, thalamus, and basal ganglia. They affect movement, cognition, and memory. And marijuana affects endogenous cannabinoids. Here we have glutamate. Glutamate is found widely throughout the brain. It increases the rate of neuron activity, learning, cognition, and memory. And the drugs that affect glutamate are ketamine, phencyclidine, and alcohol. Here we have norepinephrine. It's found in the midbrain, the VTA, cerebral cortex, and the hypothalamus. It's involved with sensory processing, movement, sleep, mood, memory, and anxiety. Drugs that affect norepinephrine are cocaine, methamphetamine, and amphetamines. And lastly, serotonin. Serotonin is found in the midbrain, the VTA, cerebral cortex, hypothalamus. It affects mood, sleep, sexual desire, and appetite. MDMA or ecstasy or Molly, LSD, and cocaine all affect serotonin. In conclusion, for the brain, the difference between normal reward and drugs reward can be described as the difference between someone whispering into your ear and someone shouting into a microphone. Just as we would turn down the volume on a radio that is too loud, the brain adjusts the overwhelming surges in dopamine and other transmitters by producing less dopamine or by reducing the number of receptors that can receive signals. Finally, as with any other disease, vulnerability to addiction differs from person to person, and there is no single factor that determines whether a person will become addicted to drugs. In general, the more risk factors a person has, the greater chance that taking drugs will lead to abuse and addiction. I hope you enjoyed today's lecture on the limbic and reward systems and how drug addiction affects them. For further information, please refer to the articles on my reference page. Thank you.